Vile, racist murderer Eddie Knight, Christopher Fairbank, has hardly been welcomed back to Albert Square with open arms. In fact, the only reason he's in Walford at all is due to Nicola Mitchell, Laura Doddington, wanting to get her hands on his cash. With his health in serious decline and not long left to live, Eddie reached out to his adoptive son, George Knight, Colin Salmon, attempting to build bridges and wanting to spend his last days in the bosom of his family. The only problem? Said family are utterly repulsed by him. The first time Eddie and his wife, Gloria Elizabeth Council, appeared in Walford, George was completely shaken to learn the manner in which he'd been adopted by them, a hideous process known as child farming. While George believed that his parents had finally revealed all to him, it was painfully apparent to audiences that there was more and worse to come. Eddie's next appearance saw him receive an award for championing diversity in boxing, and he dedicated a large portion of his acceptance speech to buttering George up, who was heartened at his dad's show of emotion. As George came to discover, though, the affectionate performance was purely to secure him as a witness in an upcoming trial. Eddie had been charged with racially motivated murder. Eddie and his friends had brutally beaten George's biological father to death, before dismembering the corpse and disposing of it in a suitcase, leaving it to be found by a dog walker later down the line. George remembered the attack taking place but until then lacked context. While Eddie and Gloria were determined to ensure that George take to the stand in defense of his dad, George was torn. His daughter Gina Knight, Francesca Henry, who'd been the victim of a torrent of microaggressions from Eddie, pleaded with him to extricate himself from the proceedings. George ultimately did the right thing, telling the court that his dad was guilty of the hideous crime, ensuring he receive a substantial prison sentence. Though George managed to make peace with his mom, her passing saw Eddie able to deliver a final, cruel blow to him when he banned George from attending her funeral. When Eddie resurfaced in hospital, his attempts to contact George were intercepted by his new girlfriend Nicola, who'd not long given birth to their baby, Ivy. Locating him, Nicola told him in no uncertain terms that George wanted nothing to do with him. When she discovered, though, that her nightclub, Harry's Barn, was deep in debt and struggling to survive, she was primed for a bribe from Eddie to allow him to move into her basement flat. On the day of Ivy's traditional Ghanaian naming ceremony, Nicola came clean to George that she'd arranged for Eddie to move in, though conveniently left out the part where she'd been paid off. Though George agreed, the rest of their families were horrified when Eddie turned up. The basement flat wasn't enough for Eddie, though, and despite Harry Mitchell's Elijah Holloway pleading on behalf of girlfriend Gina to end the scheme, Nicola doubled down on ensuring Eddie was allowed to live upstairs and fully become a member of the family again to earn her payoff. Today's episode saw George remain deeply uncomfortable with Eddie's presence. Despite needing to attend a meeting, he refused his dad's offer of taking care of Ivy while Nicola expressed milk, instead opting to take the crying baby with him. When Gina found him actively avoiding his own home, she told her dad of her concerns, but Harry George was unable to focus and left Gina bereft. Later at Harry's Barn, Gina lamented her situation to Penny Branning, Kitty Castledine, desperate to help her dad out of the rotten circumstances he's found himself in. With Eddie unable to legally live with George and Nicola having launched a deceptive campaign to allow him to stay, she pondered the idea of reporting the scam to the police. Penny pointed out that Nigel Bates, Paul Bradley, funeral was mere days away, and causing such an explosion would make things 10 times harder. Heeding her warning, Gina promised to wait until after the funeral, but committed to removing Eddie from the equation once and for all. Will the Gina and the police get Eddie before his illness does? The rain hammered down on Albert Square like the sky itself was trying to wash away the sins buried beneath Walford streets. Inside the Vic, voices buzzed with gossip, pints clinked against wooden tables, and nobody noticed the black car parked silently across from the pub. Not at first. Because tonight wasn't supposed to be about fear. It was supposed to be about celebration. Finally convinced George to host a charity boxing event at the Arches, and half the square had turned up to support it. But while laughter echoed through the pub, one man sat alone in the shadows nursing a whiskey he barely touched. EastEnders villain Eddie Knight had returned weeks ago claiming he wanted redemption. Nobody believed him completely, but nobody expected how far he'd go either. Especially not George. George stood behind the bar staring across the room at Eddie, his jaw tight. Ever since Eddie came back into their lives, chaos had followed. Secrets, threats, manipulation. The old Eddie was still there beneath the polished smile. And tonight George could feel something bad coming. "You all right?" Elaine asked quietly. George nodded, though he clearly wasn't. "I just want him gone." Across the room, Eddie slowly raised his glass toward George with a smug grin. It wasn't forgiveness he wanted. It was control. Again. Meanwhile, Gina and Anna were upstairs arguing about their dad. Gina insisted Eddie was planning something dangerous, while Anna desperately wanted to believe her grandfather had changed. "You didn't see his face earlier," Gina whispered. "He's hiding something." Before Anna could answer, the sound of screeching tires exploded outside. Everyone froze. Then came a deafening crash. The Vic windows rattled violently. Panic erupted instantly as people rushed outside into the pouring rain. George pushed through the crowd first and stopped dead in the middle of the square. The black car had slammed directly into the side of the arches. Smoke curled from the wreckage. And Eddie Knight was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Elaine gasped. But George already knew. He sprinted toward the garage, ignoring shouted warnings behind him. Flames flickered inside the damaged building as twisted metal creaked dangerously. Then through the smoke George spotted him. Eddie, pinned beneath fallen debris. Blood streamed down the side of his face, but somehow he was still conscious. Still smiling. "You came," Eddie croaked. George stared at him in disbelief. "What have you done?" Eddie coughed painfully before laughing under his breath. "You really think this was an accident?" Outside, sirens screamed closer. Inside the garage, George realized the horrifying truth. Eddie had planned this. Not to kill George. Not to escape Walford. But to make himself the victim one final time. "You're sick," George snapped. Eddie's smile faded slightly. "No. I'm forgotten." For the first time, George saw something unexpected in the old gangster's eyes. Fear. Not fear of dying. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Eddie had spent his entire life controlling people through intimidation. But now the square had moved on without him. His empire was gone. His family despised him. Even his enemies barely cared anymore. This wasn't revenge. It was desperation. The fire crackled louder above them. George stepped forward, trying to pull debris away, but Eddie grabbed his arm suddenly. "Listen to me," Eddie whispered urgently. "There's money hidden." George frowned. "What money?" "The accounts offshore your girls." Before Eddie could finish, part of the ceiling collapsed nearby, sending sparks everywhere. "George!" Elaine screamed from outside. "You need to get out." George looked between the fire and Eddie. Every instinct told him to leave the evil man behind after everything he'd done. But George Knight wasn't Eddie. And that's what Eddie finally understood. "You're better than me," Eddie muttered bitterly. George tried pulling him free again, but the debris wouldn't move. Then Eddie did something nobody expected. He shoved George backward. Hard. George stumbled just as another beam crashed down between them in an explosion of sparks and flames. "Go!" Eddie roared. For one brief moment, their eyes locked through the smoke. The manipulative gangster. The broken father. The monster Walford feared. And suddenly, Eddie Knight looked like a man completely alone. George escaped seconds before the garage erupted into flames. The explosion rocked the square. Screams filled the air. And as residents watched firefighters battle the inferno, one devastating reality slowly began to sink in. Eddie Knight never came out. But the shock wasn't just that Eddie died. It was how. Nobody expected the ruthless villain to sacrifice himself for George. Even if part of it came from guilt or pride or one final attempt at redemption, it changed everything the Knight family believed about him. Later that night, George sat silently in the Vic holding the scorched watch firefighters recovered from the scene. Gina sat beside him quietly. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked softly. George stared at the damaged watch face, then sighed. "I think for 1 second he wanted to." Outside, Walford slowly returned to normal. But somewhere beneath the smoke and ashes, Eddie Knight's secrets remained buried. And in Albert Square, secrets never stay hidden forever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to EastEnders Spoilers Official.